Arguably the most famous architect of our time, the purpose of this small symposium is for our architecture school to commemorate Gehry's work and to reflect why the buildings of Gehry are held in such high esteem, not just by architectural critics, but maybe much more important, by the people of every walk of life. One example of his societal stature: on the day of his passing, major cable networks such as CBS had a 2.5-minute segment on Gehry in their national evening news. It is absolutely extraordinary, really unheard of, that any architect would get such exposure. So the plan for this symposium is this. We have 4 speakers who will each give a 15-minute presentation. After the 4 presentations, we will have 45 minutes for an open discussion with questions, statements, and opinions from the students and anyone else who is here. Before I introduce the 4 speakers, I want to point out that Chris Pritchard and Alden Haywood designed and fabricated the display for this event. I would also like to thank Andrew Durfee for the organization for today. Our presenters today, the first speaker will be Jim, to be followed by Marcus, then Ramtin, and last but not least Ben. The speakers have been asked to respond to the following question. Why was Frank Gehry the most impactful architect of his time, of our time? Let's begin.
Okay, good morning everybody. My name is Jim Bassett. Very excited to be here and talk about Frank Gehry's work. But I want to start by first thanking a number of folks. Of course, thank you, Marcus, for creating this event and getting us all together. Thank you, Chris and Colin, for a poster that really finds another register of all together. Andrew and the comm teams for connecting us out to the universe. And to all my colleagues on the panel for helping us kind of stretch the idea or stretch the range of what we think about a particular architect and that architect's work. And of course, thank you, Frank Gehry. And good morning, everybody. Thank you all for being here and for looking to be part of a conversation that tries to make sense of the impact of a particular architect and that architect's work, who in name is familiar. But why? Why is that? Why does it linger? To be sure, over my years in architecture, both in practice and in the academy, the response to Gehry's work is complicated. It changes over time, and particularly as it's considered through many different lenses, different ideas, different values. For context, my own engagement with Gehry's architecture began as an undergraduate student, trying to make sense of the work of the 80s, and in particular, architecture and the discourse of architecture as it sort of passed through things like deconstructivism and other frameworks that challenged my preconceptions about what architecture could be. After moving to Los Angeles for graduate school, I had the opportunity to visit many of his early projects scattered about the city, and they struck me as both casual and intentional, loose in some ways, yet very deliberate, a kind of peculiar tension in that sort of first experience of the work. I also had the opportunity to work in Gehry's office on 2 projects, the Guggenheim Bilbao and the Ryson building in Prague, commonly known as the Dancing House. You might be familiar with Fred and Ginger at the end of the bridge. But I'm not going to talk about those projects. Instead, I want to talk about the Disney Concert Hall. And I'm going to start with this image. This is the image from the winning competition entry for the project. This was the year is 1988. Incidentally, I was a first-year student in 1988. And I think, I decided to talk about this project because in a way it parallels my own sort of entry into architecture, but it also says a lot about how much architecture changed during the period of this building being constructed. This model is kind of interesting. It's not exactly representative of his body of work at the time, but there are still some clues to its influences. And I think, again, it's a good kind of point of reference, maybe as a kind of timeline for the project itself, but also within his full body of work. So to follow work from this time was to witness architecture structured around a kind of core quality of inquiry. I would always say that this work was sort of a work of inquiry. And then find its kind of material and physical realization in the form of a discovery. It was also to follow significant changes in the profession at large. And there's a great deal of time between this model and the building's realization, 15 years, in fact. So this is 1988, and the building was completed in 2003. Just a little bit, I mean, kind of, again, some context of where I'm coming from. I went to undergraduate school during this time. I then moved to Los Angeles and went to graduate school. I worked in this office for a period of time. I worked for another 10 years afterwards, and this project was completed kind of 1 year before the end of that span that I just talked about. So just think about how much happens in 15 years in the world of architecture, particularly this period of time. So maybe we can open up a few different ways of considering his work. I want to look at the work through different ways of thinking about architecture that transcend the limitation of a single work and yet are best expressed through the single work itself. Number one is ideas and the relationship to things. Number two is the medium of architecture and maybe your medium of your architecture and how we think about our medium. And three, it's order. And in particular, for me to talk about order in Gehry's work, I feel like I need to move into the idea of multiplicity in terms of order, to talk about diverse and coexisting realities and emergent phenomena and kind of other ways to get a handle on what we might think of as sort of idea of ordering in the work. So let's get to slide number 2. So this is a little bit, it gives you another sense of the project we're looking at a little bit more obliquely here. And I'll be honest, when I first saw this model, I was a bit underwhelmed. I'll just be honest, I was a little disappointed. You know? And it wasn't talked about so much, the building, the form, the actual artifact. And in some sense, it almost seemed to be beside the point. And this is hard to say when referring to an architect and his body of work that I would characterize as most accessible through the thing itself. A body of work that has been little explained by the architect himself, and much more so debated and discussed by others, as we are doing here today. In an oft-quoted characterization of the proposal, Gehry called it a living room for the city. And that idea really got in front of its physical or material reality. I think people actually were so comfortable with the idea of a living room for the city that they didn't get caught up on the early form, the sort of ugly duckling phase, I guess you could say, of a project, which we all experience and we all have to some extent. So this idea is a clear and seemingly unambiguous statement. A living room for the city was both accessible as an idea and strangely comforting. And I think that comforting quality was something Gehry was very conscious of. He was aware, moving into a kind of large civic work, that people were worried. They had seen his smaller projects with complicated structures and difficult forms, and they really sort of rode this kind of comfort to the project. So everyone has an idea of a living room. In a way, it's both shared and not shared, not possible to share fully. But it's an idea that can hold difference. And there's a nod toward this in the form, a transparent core embraced by an assemblage of solid and protective forms. It's also an idea, but it's an idea, but it's also a search through the medium of architecture. This is one of the early drawings of the concert hall at the core of this building. And I want to introduce a term to you, maybe it's unfamiliar. It was a term that Vasari wrote about in drawing, kind of in sort of description of history of art practices, called pentimento. And it can be translated or understood as a line work and drawing that searches for a final form. Literally, it's translated as penitence, which is maybe a kind of a line work gathering subtle meaning of a reflective correction, a reflective judgment, looking for, seeking a kind of final form. The poet William Carlos Williams, in a poem called A Sort of Song, says, "No ideas but in things." No ideas but in things. For architecture, it's very provocative to say this. It sounds a little bit like putting language in its place. We're saying something about the limits of what can be said or what needs to be said about things and about architecture. In the living room for the city, the idea is both your idea right now and the thousand variations, the living rooms of others, the living room that can be an intimate space, warm or resoundingly animated, a living room in the aftermath of a dinner party. To experience the project as a living room for the city is to experience the openness of its center and the protection of its shell, and this range, alternating tensions moving from background to foreground, multiple to whole, both grounding and disruptive simultaneously. Its medium is malleability, not the medium is malleable. I mean to say the medium is malleability. Folded paper forms, rigid materials, planar surfaces, flex, and mass resists. 2 points make a line. It is absolutely ordinary at some level of reading it. It makes sense. It holds together. But those ideas, 2 points make a line, mass resists, exist in many, many forms within the project. And of course, the project was studied through models. This is kind of an earlier model, and at many different scales. This is kind of a little bit later when they're really fine-tuning the concert hall and doing a number of studies related to acoustics. The medium is malleability. The models are the framework for the search, and the search is redefined through the thing, emergent qualities, and the qualities of a thing made. Is it a building or a collection of buildings? Uniquely, it is experienced as a whole and a collection of form. The living room is a single-centered space. The living room of a single-centered space is perhaps a stable model, a traditional but bound image, a singularity. Disney Concert Hall gives way to a multiplicity of centers. It resists a singular image. It's difficult to draw even the kind of traditional boundaries of perspectival framework or distorted and bent and almost useless. Unlike Borges's one-to-one map that he refers to in The Exactitude of Science, which everyone should be familiar with, these ideas or frameworks for evaluation must be cast to the desert, abandoned for other modes of engagement, chiefly direct engagement. And we need to invent a new language to speak about it. And certainly they had to invent a new language. This is a really interesting early drawing or early model, and the way that they were trying to convert this into two-dimensional drawings is they basically just put it in a box and then looked through the box and drew on the box those forms. What do the elevations look like for this building? The building is resisting those kinds of conventions of architecture that, in a way, formed architecture for many, 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 many years. The models advance and chase and begin to catch up with the drawings, and drawings must then become more precise. The project timeline is parallel to an astonishing number of advances in means of representation and communication of films, digitizers, software, CATIA, transforming into Gehry technologies, and then these all having major impacts on manufacturing. Not unlike stereotomic drawing, new tools were created to create an architecture as it was envisioned, tools that open new materials to new scales, not necessarily new forms, but new scales. It's important to dwell on this for a moment. Does your architecture accommodate itself to the tools you use, or do you have to create tools to to arrive at the architecture you're looking for? Are you just subservient to the tools at your disposal now? Or do you bend them to find the architecture that you're searching for? This is astonishing to imagine the work that came out of this one office and largely around this particular project that influenced all of the discipline of architecture going forward. When I first saw this project in the office around 1993, the formal language, the same really as it's manifest today, was the material was milled limestone. There was a large mock-up, maybe 10 feet by 15 feet, that was limestone on a frame. A material pursued for quality of light on its surface. Of course, it became stainless steel in the end for many reasons. Its idea, means, and medium and form, each of the avenues of exploration, the studies of concert halls around the world, the acoustic studies, the material studies, the invention of new tools, and the conception of order strike a multiplicity, shedding traditional boundaries between ideas and traditional boundaries sort of held up by conventions of architecture and architecture's role in the city. All of these studies accumulate not by adding up to different, but by adding up to more depth, or adding up to depth, to what it is and what it has been and what has been said about it, so that it becomes recognizable again, even though transformed. In other words, complexity is not simplified, but made comprehensible. Complexity becomes the reference, not chaos, but related to the multiple and forking paths of meaning. It is a living room that has become multi-centered. Every spot in the concert hall is different, not in terms of good or bad, but in terms of the space of the experience, the space of music, and the experience of one's physical proximity, not just as an image. That experience and memory is our own complexity. As an idea, it is not limited to these forms. Gehry has simply demonstrated the dialogue with traditional narratives, which are normative, assumed boundaries, and reveals them and reminds us of our own freedom and gives us permission to pursue our own architecture. Thank you.
Good morning. If you don't mind, I get up. I prefer stuff and I can walk around a little bit, but I see my own images. My argument is this afternoon or this morning. Frank Gehry is the most impactful architect of his time because his buildings brought forward the greatest amount of newness. So therefore, I'm going to speak about newness. When we discuss or critique the work of Gehry, according to the criteria of newness, I'm going to take you for about the next 12 minutes or so into the field of architectural theory. Newness is a principle within architectural theory. Theory of architecture is precise, it's a precise science, and therefore I will use some notes. In addition, newness is an epistemological category. Broadly speaking, epistemology is or deals with questions of knowledge. So my presentation has the following structure. First, I'm going to speak about what is meant with newness. Then second, I'm going to briefly invoke the work of Catalan architect Ramtin Haghnazar to compare. And then third, argue how masterful Gehry's work is regarding newness. First, newness is understood as an aspect of novelty. It is a basic experiential cognition in a formal architectonic sense. Second, only a building that is new, a building that embodies a quality for a person in the way they encounter it has the force to rouse a person's power of imagination and to captivate them. Unequivocally, architecture must strive for newness. It is the third point, it is the social task of architecture to make people creative. That is the ultimate reason why buildings must have aspects of something new. Therefore, newness has a specific task in architecture. Newness is the initiator that provokes the inhabitant of a building to engage in a discourse with the building and therefore with the world. Without newness, people will simply leave a building by the wayside, as they do with all buildings that do not contain something that engages them. Therefore, buildings or a building must bring something new to the fore, a thought, an idea. Newness allows for a kind of thinking ahead. And it is precisely through the provocation of something new that human beings become creative. In that sense, newness provides a positive moment, a kind of an inspiration. And it is that mental constitution of the new that will allow people to be creative. Everyone feels such creative inspiration when they come across buildings of this kind. 4. In contrast, even if a building is built with great constructive competence and skill, and maybe also with great technological innovation, but it does not have newness, it will not fulfill architecture's ultimate social task, namely to engage people in a discourse so that they can extend themselves and change their viewpoints. 5. Newness is not understood as synonymous with progress. The task of newness is not advancement and improvement in the sense of any kind of development, technological or otherwise. A building made of piled up stones can still be new today. For a lack better terms or to describe it architecturally, newness is of an epistemological dimension. 6. Ultimately, newness is of an ontological importance for us. Newness is fundamental and precedes any critical legitimation. Therefore, newness is in the realm of what is known as aesthetic knowledge and not intellectual knowledge. 7. Unfortunately, newness in architecture is often derogatorily associated with the fashionable. However, newness has little to do with the fashionable. Rather, newness is the kind of ontological moment that touches deeply rooted existential questions concerning our place in the world. One could say it's a search for truth. Why will people always search for truth? They search for truth because it offers them a new framework for sense-making. 8. It is the architect who assumes responsibility for designing something that contains newness. The architect is the shaper of that newness. That is no simple task. Newness requires a kind of philosophical moment, an idea. And that idea, manifested in a building, must be new. Newness is what makes buildings relevant. Hence, the creative quest ends as soon as an architect stops seeking newness. There is no need for an architect if newness is foregone. Quick visual reminder of Gehry versus Gehry. Newness is not timeless. Gehry's work is indicative of the tenuous and difficult role of newness in the reception of architecture, not just in our profession, but also in the world at large. It is noteworthy that Frank Gehry's architecture has been subject to a very different reception to that compared of Antoni Gaudí. Gaudi's architecture was considered bizarre at the time when he produced his work. Gaudi's work did not speak to broader societal currents when it was built. It was considered anachronistic. In contrast, Gehry's work has never been labeled as naive and bizarre, nor for that matter was it labeled as particularly fashionable. Instead, Gehry's architecture has always been taken as a serious contribution, and his work was understood as significant for society as soon as he architected it. Gehry's mastery of newness. First, the fact that Gehry's work found admiration as soon as it was built suggests Gehry had an exceptionally keen awareness and understanding of what degree of newness people of his time would be able to absorb with their own power of imagination and subsequently use as a reference for their own attempts to wrestle with their own existential questions. Second, it is Gehry's understanding of the prevalent societal currents of the world that allow him to give his buildings exactly the right amount of newness. Third, it is very likely that Gehry's architecture would also have been labeled as bizarre had he designed it in Gaudi's day. However, the fact that Gehry was able to judge his times correctly and that his buildings were not rejected as bizarre and absurd speaks directly to his capability to understand nascent societal currents. To be able to do so is arguably the most difficult social competence required of an architect. 4. Architecture should never be bizarre, nor is it desirable for people to begin to associate buildings with the bizarre. Gehry mastered the important and very difficult question to establish where exactly these demarcations happen to lie at any given time. These boundaries are constantly shifting. 5. Gehry's mastery is that he architected buildings with aspects of newness of such a degree that they became actualized just prior to the moment when these architectonic formulations became acceptable to a sufficiently large segment of society. To conclude, Frank Gehry was the most impactful architect of his time because he found, through his buildings and their precise degree of newness, that sliver of space, that tiny epistemological gap between the unknown and the known that moves humankind forward. Thank you.
So when we want to talk about why Gehry is the most impactful architect of his era, I think from my perspective, the answer is not about style or even originality. I think it is about what architecture is allowed to be. So somehow in his work, he forced architecture, engineering, and construction involved together. So that's the most important things that I think we need to talk about, and I want to do. So architecture from something limited by its own tools converted to the driver of technology. That's something that he did, and this reversing the usual relationship between technology and tool and architecture is something that we're thinking. Okay, to understand it better, what was architecture before Gehry? I want to talk about this example that Mario Karpov mentioned. The question is why most of buildings look like shoeboxes, but not potatoes. The answer is not about taste. It is more about representation. The point is architecture is limited by the way that we can represent our design. So for representing a shoebox, because when you design something, you need someone to build it and you need to transfer this information. When you want to represent something like a box or a simple object, you just need 8 points, for example, or a couple of drawings. So limited amount of drawings can completely transfer this data and represent your object. But if you want to do the same thing for a potato or any other things, you need millions of points. You need thousands of cross-sections, okay? So it is somehow infinite information that you cannot do it through the simple and conventional method of representation. So for a long time, before Gehry, architecture was limited by this limitation. So architects only design something that can be drawn, and engineers rationalize something that can be calculated, and somehow builders made things that could be repeated. That's something that happened for a long time. But even modernism, despite its ambitious, heavily relied on orthogonality, standardization, and repetition. Architecture largely behaved itself because tool demanded behavior. But Gehry refused to behave like a toolbox. And I think the importance of his work is not about the appearance, it is not symbolic gesture or something like that. I think even the form or the architectural object is not just an image that comes in the end. It is the result of a process. It emerged through the chain of operations. And that's important. Gehry design process worked through a sketch to physical models and finally digital translation, which was different from the other method of design. And that's where the problem emerged, because you cannot do such a thing with normal tools, because normally digital tools are something, before Gehry, were something just for representation. So it was a representational aid. But they started to use new tools and new technology. So they started to adopt CATIA, a software that basically designed for aerospace industries and never meant to use in the architecture industry. They started to use it not because it makes it faster or more efficient or more beautiful, because technically nothing else could do the job. So they tried to use CATIA to somehow answer those questions and make them able to design and build those kind of forms. So architecture changed from something that just following tools to the main driver of the technology in this area. And actually, Gehry used architecture to somehow expose the limits of technology. So by this introduction, I think the most important thing is digital shift. So from this point, this work is the importance of these works is not about look or style. It is about the digital shift. It is about the disciplinary shift from architecture, something represented by drawing, to architecture that represented and emerged through the computation. So digital tools and these kind of works are something like a driver of the architecture, not just a passive aid. So this changed a little bit that we think about architecture in a way that rules of form and fabrication exist in a computational model. And Gehry's importance is somehow because it was the first example of such a thing, that we can make and build complexity, not as an exception, as a system that can evolve. And this is the foundation of what we call it parametric design, mass customization. These things are ordinary now, but at that time it was revolutionary. So impact of Gehry can be discussed in three main categories from my perspective. The first one is about practice that mentioned before. He normalized complexity. And something like parametric design, complicated forms, these are something ordinary and common now because someone first made them unavoidable. The second thing is about collaboration. His work very complicated, and it demanded a collaboration of architects, designers, fabricators, software specialists, builders, simultaneously, not sequentially. And that's something that was never experienced. And this is the base of what we call it integrated design or feedback loop design or computational design, pipeline workflows. So these are standard in advanced practice right now, but it was radical at that time. And the last thing is about education. Today we expect the students make, model, prototype, understand material, structure, geometry, fabrication at the same time. And architecture is, we don't teach architecture as just a formal expression. And you can see his footprint in this method. And he somehow expanded what architecture students are allowed to attempt. It makes it routine for architecture to be risky, complicated, and technically demanding. It is important to understand that definitely his work has some problems, issues of cost, buildability, repetition, even performance, and many other things. These are real, and these are further discussion, not here. But the important thing is that impact is not about perfection. Impact is about what comes after. So he changed it. The point is, Gehry shouldn't be treated as a template. He better understood as a catalyst, as someone whose work forced the discipline to confront its own limits. And I think his value is not just about providing answers. It is more about raising questions and opening new doors. So at the end, I want to say that Frank Gehry mattered not because everyone should design like him, but because after him, architecture could no longer pretend that form, structure, material, and technology were separate conversations. And when these conversations linked together computationally, architecture was never the same. And that, I would argue, is why Gehry is the most impactful architect of his era.
It's a real honor to be here. This is my my name is Ben. Very happy to be here. I wrote about 2 paragraphs that I'm going to read, and then I have about 15 slides. The title of my brief talk is the Vitra Design Museum, A Fool's Errand. Where should I sit?
Maybe the other
Away from Ramtin. Okay. So feedback. So this is Frank Gehry. Frank Gehry belongs to a rarefied group of architects who eventually acquired the ability to transcend the typical creative process defined by critique, refinement, or manneristic recombination, and instead entered into a more purified realm of invention, intuition, perhaps, if you will allow it, artistic genius. Like the Fool and tarot cards, at a certain point in his career, Gehry willfully steps off of a cliff into the unknown, propelled forward by a childlike sense of wonder in the absence of any rational plan or blueprint, which might curtail his eventually explosive artistic discoveries. What I want to say will first establish his comparatively modest origins through an examination of 3 early projects, which represent a period of I'm calling it a dialogue with precedent. His Santa Monica residence as it relates to Los Angeles architect Richard Neutra and the mid-century modern movement. His China Day headquarters reinterpreting a Michelangelesque cornice cap. And finally, the Indiana Avenue apartments, which abstract and transform the functionalist language of early 20th century modernists into something garish, obscene, and as Markus was talking about, new. These projects represent a punk rock-like spirit of revolt and criticism, but all the same, they exist within a bracketed language, at least partially determined by their forebears. The Vitra Design Museum, on the other hand, which is the subject of the talk, marks a rupture. This was Gehry's first international commission, projecting his hitherto unseen combinatorial deconstructivist language onto the European world stage. It was also Gehry's first project, dealing with, in the main, a Baroque-like degree of curvaceous exuberance and all the inherent technological hurdles that would inevitably entail, and that Ramtin just described so well. Lastly, arguably, and this is one of the primary preoccupations, it was also Gehry's first direct and unmediated extension of his now iconic pseudo-architectural language of pure sculptural form, magnetized, aestheticized, sanctified, gorged, gouged, completely innocent, completely insane, and completely Gehry. So this is the first of the precedents that I want to talk about. This is Richard Neutra on the left, his Morehouse in Ojai. And like a lot of the mid-century work of this era, it is playing this ambiguous game with inside and outside as the beautiful desert landscape of Palm Springs is suggestively brought into this dematerialized interior space, and simultaneously with spider-like legs, the interior architecture is brought into this space of the landscape surround. And so rather than creating this clear boundary between interior and exterior, the house, this domestic space, occupies a liminal in between. And
for all of Gehry's inventiveness at a tectonic level, having to do with, I would say, reinterpretation of Gordon Latta Clark and Robert Rauschenberg and others, I think that his house, which was one of his first, let's say, national moments as an architect, is nevertheless in dialogue at a meta level with this idea of critiquing inside and the outside. So here we have, I don't know why there's this feedback. Here we have the pink bungalow house on the right, and we have his bizarre extension on the left. And what's in between is meant to suggestively imply that this was the asphalt driveway. So we are neither in the inside of the bungalow, nor are we in the suburban landscape of Santa Monica. We are somewhere in between. Next precedent is this project for the China Day headquarters in Venice Beach. And this was done in collaboration with Klaus Oldenburg. And I would argue is doing something similar to the Klaus Oldenburg. This is a piece of basically enlarged pop art sculpture, clearly binoculars. And what Gehry is doing, in my opinion, is he's taking a classical, or perhaps a Wagnerist Michelangelo horse cap, and he's enlarging it to this preposterous degree, almost as if you took a digital image and zoomed in on it so much that the pixels began to disassociate from the original image and produce, something new. Nevertheless, I bracket it within this early period of Gehry's development as a creative individual because it's clearly in dialogue with this architectural language. This is the last project, which has to do with a historical critique of, I would say, this modernist spirit of form follows function. This is a house for the Alzenfant family in Paris by Le Corbusier, and we appreciate its compositional excellence because he's taking these functionalist elements such as this factory window, such as these factory sawtooth roofs, and this beautiful circulation staircase, and he's making that the focus of the architecture. This is an architecture without an extraneous ornamental facade. It's a sort of what you see is what you get. And I would argue that Gehry's projects of this period are playing a similar game, but they're kind of poking fun at this notion of functionalism. And so here for the Indiana Avenue apartments, he's taking something like a staircase, but by zooming in on it, exaggerating it, putting it at this cockeyed angle that's taking this subtraction, taking a bite out of this cube, it becomes disassociated entirely from its original functionalist context and becomes a piece of almost sculptural composition. So this project, in my opinion, marks the decisive turning point in his career. Again, this was his first international commission, almost as a pseudo-architectural celebrity. This is for the Vitra Design Museum. It's a furniture company. And I think that this front entryway, this is the east facade more or less, is doing a couple of things. Number one, it's ushering in this new era of Gehry-like curvature, which would become a hallmark of his work for the next 3 decades. And as we saw, is really part and parcel of the spirit of a lot of the great projects that define kind of his Baroque period of heroic civic architecture. But I would say it's also doing kind of one last final quotation, saying a fond farewell to this period of historical critique. This is Louis Kahn's Richard Medical Building in Philadelphia. It's an extraordinary work of modernism as this double cantilever triumphantly suggests this very proud, well-crafted sculptural moment. It's also eroding away the corners such that you enter the building on the oblique. So I think this quotation is happening somewhat literally in this entryway to the Vitra project, but as we'll see on the next slide, it's ushering in a new spirit, which is not really concerned with the representation or the literal structural apparatus of an architecture, but is concerned with illusion, is concerned with a weightlessness, a surreal sense of anti-gravity, and also would, I think importantly usher in quite possibly one of the most important hallmarks of any deconstructivist architecture, which, to put it very simply, is pointy things. Make your buildings pointy. Pointy architecture. Here is the interior space, which carries all of the evolving Gehry mannerisms at the time, but evolved to a much more monumental stature. The space would appear to be extremely ambiguous and complex, as these 7 or 8 different volumes appear to be magically intersecting with one another. But one of the important hallmarks of the sort of Gehry signature, or the process of working with Gehry, is that he honors the programmatic economy of the building. He pays very close attention to budget, he pays very close attention to function, and generally in his architecture, and we see it very elegantly in this building, he delivers the project on a very simple basis. So you can see the program for this museum is organized around 6 or 7 boxes constituting galleries and offices and so forth. And the way that he achieves these mysterious spatial and symbolic effects is by, number one, eroding the corner with this relatively small bite taken out of, and then also through the addition of these volumes, these skylight volumes that we'll see on the exterior. This was, again, an important moment. It's an international commission. It's also Gehry shedding his skin and moving away from this period of renegade, low-budget residential architecture, and he's now operating within the method and the medium of more or less the modern masters of the early 20th century. So you can see this building is actually a beautiful work of concrete architecture that has been plastered over. Also, as far as the construction, there was an extremely important moment that I want to identify, which would serve to foreshadow his coming career of this digital architect who would usher in this new paradigm. As I said, for this project, he becomes interested in a Baroque-like degree of curvature, cylindrical volumes, sinuous S-curves, and one of the key compositional moments on the west facade is this spiraling staircase. And despite his success with dealing with extremely difficult geometry in the past, this was actually an architectural problem that completely confounded Gehry. And it was very irksome to him when it was finally completed because of this particular moment here. Maybe it doesn't really seem like that big of a deal to you, but Gehry lost a considerable amount of sleep over what he referred to as a kink. And this is because, owing to the limitations of descriptive geometry on paper, he was unable to adequately provide his contractors with enough of a graphical description about how this thing got built, and it thus resulted in this rather ugly kink. And so Gehry, in the back of his mind, for the next 5 years, would start thinking about and earnestly seeking out professional advice and guidance about how he could render these curvaceous shapes with a greater degree of accuracy, and as Ramtin talked about, and Jim as well, eventually resulted in his adaptation of Petito. This is the main sculptural facade. This, in my opinion, represents his jumping off point. This represents his rupture. And I think that is because he is leaving behind this idea of an architect as an assembler of programmatic volume, as an assembler of a functional delivered program. And instead he is thinking more like a painter. He's thinking more like a sculptor. He's thinking about symbolism. He's thinking about composition. And it results in what I think is an extremely masterful piece of, again, painterly composition. We look at this, and at first glance, we see something that appears to be this entropic mess of volumes just thrown together haphazardly in the middle of the night. But I think seeing beside this
golden ratio spiral, we see an overall compositional clarity as this thing starts to gather a sort of gravitational pull towards this portal-like fixture on the composition. And this creates a sculptural dynamism. It also, again, suggests the collection and the organization of forces in this spiraling-like gesture, which would become part and parcel of this heroic period of Baroque civic architecture. This is the Guggenheim Bilbao, of course, and these are some images of the golden rectangle occurring in nature. And here you can see that this is not simply the willful assemblage of shapes, but as it were, appears to take all of these unseeable forces from the city, from the people, and represents them as this river-like current, which is then gushing in through this void space in this, again, gravitational moment where things are getting concentrated. So Gehry is about taking this wild energy, but then concentrating it like the tip of a pencil into this extremely singular point of focus. This is a project about a decade later for the DB Bank, and I think it's very difficult to look at an architecture like this and not, at least subconsciously, think about a somewhat spiritual, cosmological, symbolic program at play. That's why I have this image over here of a black hole. Is this thing some kind of sorcerous conjurer that is resulting in this chaotic, centrifuge of movement, or is this thing resulting from this, implosion, these force-like fields of energy colliding with one another? But again, despite Gehry's, wielding of enormous volumes in space, he concentrates the perspective, whether it's an interior space or an exterior elevation, he concentrates the perspective into these central moments, making the composition elegant and very powerful. So here we go back to, again, this very important moment, the west facade of the Vitra Museum. And we see Gehry, again, leaving behind his status as a programmatic organizer of space, a functionalist, and we see somebody thinking about symbolism. We see somebody, as Markus was talking about, thinking about aesthetics. It's very important to think about this building as an aesthetic experience. One can see this as some sort of abstraction of a Baroque-like palace, which would lead one up a, let's say, curling staircase into this main portal. But the fact that it is not literally the front entryway and remains at a distance keeps it in this realm of the imagination, in the mind. As we all know, the Wizard of Oz is just a painting. And then when they finally discover the wizard, he's but smoke and mirrors. This is a Aztec or Mayan ruin outside of Mexico City. And my rather controversial statement is that who knows what happens in here? Probably not so much good stuff, but maybe somebody's just doing their taxes in there. Honestly, maybe somebody's just counting ears of corn, it's not like some prophet. Who knows? But it suggests that something profound is happening up there. And certainly to the common folk who probably didn't have access into this, hallowed sacred ground, would have believed as much. So that's the power of keeping things at a distance, keeping things in the realm of aesthetics, keeping things painterly, keeping things sculptural. And I just conclude with this final image. This is the Truman Show on the left. I hope most people have seen this movie. What happens to Truman after he goes through this black door? We don't know. What is that? And we're left to imagine. We're left to sit there for the next 10 or 15 minutes. What is Truman's life going to be like after he enters the real world? We don't cry about it. And then here, similarly, what's going to happen when we go inside this magical
don't know. It remains in our imagination, and we dwell on it. So that's my presentation. I'm really looking forward to this talk, and I conclude.
I have a question. I believe you once told me a story about a Perrier water bottle on a model. Can you tell the group, because it was really impactful for me about how you think you see something when you leave for the weekend and you come back and you see something new. Once you have clear eyes and once you sort of pull yourself away from it a little bit. That story is stuck with me. And it's funny.
So if you all know Bilbao, Guggenheim, Bilbao, et al., sort of the main core where the galleries are and sort of entry comes from the front, and then the front side faces the river. And then the long galleries that Ben showed, at the end of those, there's a tower that connects up to another upper road. So very early on in the process of that project developing, it was a fairly small model. I'm going to say kind of like this. Maybe it was 120 or 116, somewhere in that kind of scale. And at that time, work was really just kind of happening around the clock, which was really pretty fantastic to just be fully steeped in the development of a project. Well, somebody just left a Perrier bottle on the model, overnight, just sitting there working. There's hot glue guns and water bottles and things around. We came back the next day to find that Frank Gehry had seen that water bottle on the model and said, "That's perfect. That's what it needs to be." We'll get Klaus Oldenburg in here. We'll do a giant bubbling fountain of water at the end. Of course, it became something else in the end, but for me, it was one of those moments of like I talked a little bit about the permission that this work opened up for me as an architect. But I think it's a kind of a freedom in coming back in the morning and seeing your work with fresh eyes and taking it for what it is in front of you, not for what you think it was supposed to be or what you preconceived it to be, but to take it as real, artifactual, spatial, and something kind of in the realm of potential. Like I said, the bottle kind of went away in the end, but I think it just opens up that that challenge, I suppose, to me and maybe to others to take your models as real things that have qualities on their own, and they may just as well be a kind of a reasonable sort of outcome to the work. I know you've experienced your professor come by and turn your model upside down, and suddenly it's better and more interesting. It's a little bit like that, learning how to do that for yourself to your work, not getting overly attached to what you think it should be, but allowing it to emerge.
I think maybe I'd invite all of you to almost speak on this as part of the process. I mean, we talk about it in the lab a lot, about Gehry working in a sort of artist sense as he's working directly on the material like you're talking about. Where when we think about architecture, we are once removed from the product through the abstraction of what is drawing, right, of documenting to hand off to somebody else. So for Gehry, the canvas was very much the model in the same way for Eisenman it was the drawing. And for students to recognize maybe that is part of the process, that we have to think about those things almost as autonomous in some ways to get to that next step. I don't know if there's something you all want to speak on that. I know it sort of backs up Ben's point about the artistry, but if there's something more there that you could kind of chew into.
Well, I was thinking about a similar point. I think, Ramtin, you were describing the fact that this was point clouds. And I think the but Gehry's angles were so incoherent and had no, let's say, logic with respect to the means of construction that they basically had to halt for like 1 year and just leave it as an empty site until they could hire, at the time, the state-of-the-art surveyor who used GPS points, who could locate the building using this, thousands of points in space. And this is such a radically different paradigm than what is described in architectural history, where, let's say, master masons in the Gothic era are constructing plans and vaults based off of strings and proportions, and there is a one-to-one relationship between the geometry and the logic of simply locating points in space. And I would say Gehry's just complete indifference to where those points are in space represents a different point of view with respect to architectural design. It is about the one-to-one translation of his sketches, and by extension of his team, his extremely, finessed models. And, I wonder whether that is just a permanent paradigm that we are meant to exist in now, dealing with a kind of limitless sculptural potential, or whether there might be some reason, symbolic or otherwise, to sort of bring back and integrate some of those primitive, surveying techniques, geometric techniques, which impart a greater level of order with respect to the construction process. I don't know if that entirely answers the question, but it's something that I find, interesting, and is, I think, that, kind of philosophical or aesthetic or formal question introduced by Gehry and Gehry alone. Well, maybe by Eisman too, but
Maybe another the question that I would ask is, how was this man, Frank Gehry, at one point, somebody, Frank Gehry, had to make a judgment how these things exactly are existing in space, and how do you get there? How was he able to do it this way, and then you could make a judgment, this is better than this. And I don't know the answer exactly how we got there, of course, we were not there, but I remember when I was an undergraduate student in Switzerland, they started to talk about this Frank Gehry, and so I decided I would go to Los Angeles to see some of his very early buildings. I remember visiting the Danziger studio, I think 1965, I think it's his first or maybe second building, and I visited this, and it's 3 white volumes, no curves, just 3 boxes. And I stood in front of this building, all sides, 4 sides, and I was absolutely puzzled by the absolutely beautiful composition of those 3 volumes intersecting with each other, and just as a shape, as an architectural shape, how it existed in space. Between that building and the Guggenheim, maybe his most famous one, was roughly 35 years. And a lot of things happened. My colleagues, talked about some of this, but it's a good question. How, what is the sort of the education of the architect that in the end, besides, yes, there are all the technological means, but in the end, technology is just a tool, and you have to make a judgment whether it's correct or incorrect. And maybe you guys, being also mostly first-year students, how do you put this together that you're at some point able to make these sort of judgments? Because that is still, I don't know how. I mean, we also don't know how Michelangelo was able to make certain judgments, and Ludwig van Beethoven was making judgments when he composed, and it needed to sound this way, not this sound. At some point maybe it's beyond education, I don't know. But somehow you have to get there in order to make that judgment. And it's not a question of technology, I believe.
I think didn't have a undergraduate education in art, so he has kind of a strong background in art, regardless if he studied or not. But if you also watch the movie Sketches of Frank Gehry, you can actually see him at work, and he works very intuitively with simple means like these models out of folded paper. But in a way, it's interesting because you can see at every level that he's not just simply imagining things, but he's responding to the material and the surfaces that he's using. Paper can do certain things and not others. And that translates also into early architecture. I think in Bilbao, it's still happening where these forms also relate to construction. So he's using ruled surfaces, so they look all warped, but they're actually straight lines that are moving through space and creating that. So you can always think about how you build it out of straight lines. So there are these, it's not just, like genius, but there's always a response to the material that he's building with, a sense of composition that is his, and then a sense of constructability of the building.
Yeah. To follow this up, we go a little bit into who is this Frank Gehry. I mean, first of all, one thing that maybe is good to know, he's one of the few architects who made it to the pinnacle of our professional discipline who was not wealthy. He grew up in very modest sort of circumstances, which that's a very good conversation. But in terms of the how he prepared himself, so. Gehry is, you should look into this. There are different sort of stages to his professional life, to professional career. He has an office and he almost sold the entire office because he wanted to do something different. So there are sort of gaps in his life. But it's why, for example, he did relatively, you would consider it relatively sort of modest sort of work. His friends that he was hanging out with in Los Angeles were the foremost artists, sort of the cutting edge artists who were pushing the envelope. That was a sort of he was not hanging out with the other architects. He was hanging out with the artists who were pushing a sort of, where the world is at this moment. And I cannot really prove it, but I would suggest those sort of relationships, those talks, were looking at work of other those people. Of course, that sort of set a ground, it was a fertile ground for him to also have an intellectual apparatus and then also an artistic skill that he eventually was able to do this. So maybe the point is also, it's quite interesting with whom you do hang out, who are your friends, physically, or also you can have also an intellectual or an artistic discussion with Michelangelo. We have access to his work. And those kind of preparation, I think, as you say, the idea that, like the famous Simpson clip in the comic here, just throwing a piece of paper on the ground and say, this is a building, I think it couldn't be further from the truth. There are decades-long sort of work within architecture and surrounding fields. And again, I was talking about this understanding of the world, that you can do that. And you should do it, and you do it in the right moment when the world is ready. That is an unbelievable accomplishment. Unbelievable. It's very difficult to do something new that is true.
You said a lot of controversial things about Newton, and you said them with such certainty that I wrote down half of them, so I feel like we should get into it. I just had one other thought. I never actually thought that these are real services, and I think you're completely right. And I think it's, the point that I was trying to say was that Vitro represents this leap forward, but you could also say that that's not true. And you can see Gehry, especially if you look at a monograph, it's taking basically baby steps. Like every single project, he takes one little baby step. I don't think he ever gets too far away from himself where the thing just collapses into a terribly high budget or poor craftsmanship, and that was kind of the original impetus of his house design, was that by saying poor craftsmanship was the idea, he thereby maintains a sort of authorial control. And so he's still within his kind of conceptual, he still has this kind of conceptual control over the entire thing. And then, so here we see, this sort of apex as an iconic building, but then several of my friends have suggested that Disney Concert Hall is, quote, better, because I think the Disney Concert Hall, in contrast, built maybe 10 years after, is double curvature all over the place. And then Seattle, a few years after that, is just completely haywire. So I think that's also another valuable lesson for students, is even as you're progressing through the years from freshman, sophomore, take baby steps, honestly. I mean, we are ultimately all of us aspiring to make, creative contributions to the field, but it can be done slowly over the course of, several years. Markus said that the Danziger project is a meditation on 3 boxes, and he kind of stayed with that vocabulary for quite a time, and then, slowly, added more things to his, repertoire.
Let's say that, first of all, thank you for the opportunity for the students, or everybody to be together, to learn and to think, and some refreshing, wonderful. And I think for the students, I think this was kind of like for the last several months, but a few people, very welcome designers, architects, away. This was one of them, Frank Gehry, also Georgia Murray, by Valentino. And during that time, I was invited to speak to some engineering students. They talk about it. I said, why architects and designers pass and they got down the global news, and some engineers when they pass, people just do not know. So that's we do not make more money in many cases, so we have a bigger impact. So I think that hopefully in a few years, in a few decades, the next Frank Gehry, or even better Frank Gehry, is going to be one of you guys. So this is going to be a new era of design and architecture. So I'm hopeful. But one thing I'm curious, and maybe you talk a little bit about Frank Gehry's connection with Virginia Tech. And Jim, you mentioned you work in his office. Can you talk a bit more other connection, maybe something that will impact his grant practice?
Yeah, sure. I don't know whether some of our faculty colleagues are there here, Bill Galway, Ryan Schmidt. No, they're not here. They couldn't better speak to this because they are students. So these were Virginia Tech students, and they worked for Gehry. There was for a while a stream of Virginia Tech students from our program, bachelor and master of architecture. I think there were other reasons. One of the reasons at that point we had access to the aerospace department somewhere next door, and the architects used CATIA. Mostly I think it was the graduate students at that point, and so I think one went to Gehry's office. Ron, I think you can see Ron. I think he can maybe attest to this, but I'm not making this stuff up. So the first went, and I think it worked out well, and then I think we had in the end about 10 students from Virginia Tech.
We have one there now.
Early on were at Gehry's office. So there was quite a contingency. I'm sure there are other relationships. That's what I know of. And I'm not the first source. Although I know one of them who worked there. Later on, I had always sort of an insight. I could always call him up and he would get me into the Gehry office, which was a fantastic. I mean, it was fantastic to leave the office. I mean, it was like a candy store. You would just want to pick up things like this. And of course, we were not supposed to do this, but I tremendously enjoyed in Santa Monica to go to the Gehry office, and I was with the
CATIA is, just in case people don't understand, because it's also an important choice.
The point is, the word CAD that we use, which is a very old word, is configurated draft, not design, technically, so it just let us draw something. So the software doesn't have any information that what is this line? So it's just a line. You know that it's a wall or whatever it is. But after a while, some engineers started to develop some kind of software that has some, it can store more information about the objects. So for example, in CATIA, when you design something, when you make something, when you draw a wire, it knows that it is a wire. And if, for example, you pass through another panel, it can let you know that this wire, for example, passed the panel and there's a collision. And something like beam models that we have today, like Revit, which is a kind of a 10-year-old software, is a kind of a version of it that's dedicated to architectural industry. But the point is, at that time, it was necessary, for example, when you model something like an airplane, to understand every single bolts, every single objects, and how you want to make it. But the hierarchy of assembly, for example, these are the things that you can store in CATIA, but not other CAD easily. But right now, there are architectural tools that have such a
So it was originally created for
aerospace. CATIA was for aerospace.
I think it's also an interesting choice for them to start using, to finding that tool to then hack it or bring it into architecture.
Fortunately, I mean, today, during the last 10 years, computational design somehow is in architecture right now, and you are not even limited to these kind of tools. You can develop your own tools too, and it is really, really important. I mean, as a computational designer during the last 15 years, I designed many different tools for different design purposes. Many of them was something that I designed for myself, but more interesting experience is when I create some design tool for someone else. And you can see, I mean, my experience was like that, you can see that they are prisoner of your tool because they can only do things that you already dictate to them. And I could really see that the result of the projects that I was in the design process from early design phase and developed, for example, the design tool, the computational design tool together with the other people, completely had different result in comparison to some other design tools that they order very specific things. Because when you are thinking about your design tool, you don't really know that what you want, because you know where you want to start, but you don't know the path. So it is something more experimental, and it needs to always keep it updated and upgrade it to what you have in mind and somehow tailor it to what you can do. So yeah, that's something that we may know more in the future.
I have a challenge for the students. So it makes me think about the first student from architecture who somehow figured out that they needed to go to aerospace engineering department. So the challenge is, when have you been in a different department here on campus to, spy a little bit, finding something that maybe, would be important. This could be on the technical side and the engineering, but I think it could also be on the humanistic side to sort of discuss certain ideas and so on. You have an unbelievable benefit of having an unbelievable campus here with all sorts of things going on. And you get a chance. So when have you been somewhere outside of your architecture school, in the aerospace department, for example, to see what they're doing and whether there might be something that might be useful for architecture. So I don't know how this happened, but I think you should get yourself into this situation, like to create opportunities, and you have have an unbelievable breadth of sort of things going on this campus.
Marcus, I also think that if you look at materials in the same way that you look at tools, where cardboard is used for packaging stuff, but you see by the chair on the picture behind you, cardboard can also be used as making furniture. In the same way that you've experienced, Marcus, where the rubber membrane, that's not made for, so I think not only questioning your tools that you're giving a prepackaged for aerospace or prepackaged for architecture, I think that's the best advice. Like go out and see what are they doing over in biology, what are they doing in neuroscience, do they have materials, do they have tools that maybe we could borrow?
I think it's also just a kind of, maybe back to this sort of notion of a permission to move outside of kind of what's normatively sort of given to you. So I'll just give you an example. So if you go to Home Depot or Lowe's, all of the materials are labeled. And you'll see shelf bracket. So this is, I'll buy this because I'm going to make a shelf. But as a material, it has very particular properties that go way beyond the name. And maybe you think about it in terms of its material and its structure and its other capacities. Last night I was making dinner and I couldn't find the towel to pick up the hot skillet. So I just pulled my sleeve down and picked it up. Like it works really good as kind of a hot pot holder. Right? It has material properties. They don't sell this as pot holder, right? But it can be that. Materials have all kinds of affordances. So when you're scrolling down the menu, you're designing a remodel for your family or something, and you're asking, what is the floor of the kitchen going to be? Okay, is it linoleum? Is it vinyl? 90% recycled content? Is it wood? And you're kind of going through those. Do you allow asphalt to be in your palette as an architect? It's a little bit weird. But when I saw that, the first time I saw that asphalt floor in the kitchen, it just kind of blew my mind. Like, how can you do that? Is that allowable? Do we have permission to go that far outside of the bounds? But of course, you see many variations, and from far back, you go to Italy, and you go into a church built in 1200, and the entire floor is a text, and carved surfaces of the bodies buried underneath the floor. Like, okay, that's permissible. And I think there's a kind of a question for all of you to pull on that thread of your own palette and medium or material that you're working, because there's no doubt when you cycle through and you select asphalt that it entirely changes the experience of being in that kitchen, of working in that kitchen, how you perceive it. And it's not even a line on the drawing. Right? It's just a note that says asphalt. There's no line on the drawing that tells us what this is. Right? But all of you can imagine Burchard with black carpet. Right? Again, it's just a note. It says black carpet. Completely different experience of that space. And I think that is very important to get in touch with those kinds of questions now. Pay attention to the world around you. Pull things into your palette. You're driving down the interstate. There's a truck that goes by with a quilted metal surface. Where do you get that? You're not going to buy it at the Home Depot or the building store, but it certainly can be part of your palette if you look for it, if you reach out into those areas. So maybe a kind of a thought here about letting go of those, again, kind of normative rules, or just at least asking why are they the way that they are? What other things can perform that same way?
Just to, the position of Frank Gehry, what he made possible for the architects that came after him, that was pointed out in various ways. This is just tremendous, the way we work. So there's this famous German philosopher, his name is Friedrich Nietzsche. He gave himself the question, for whom does an architect build? For whom does an architect build? He gave this somewhat, maybe you don't like that answer, but he said, the architect builds for the next great architect. And I think Gehry, his work. For example, the material palette of his own house in Santa Monica opened up possibilities for other very good architects. For example, let's say Ray Koolhaas. I guarantee you that Ray Koolhaas saw certain possibilities after seeing the work of Gehry. It opened up. Koolhaas is no slouch either. A good architect, very good architect. But there was somebody behind that said, this is the realm of architecture. But then it makes sense. It's not just a gimmick. It makes sense in that time in the 1980s, or when this was built, that we go that route in architecture. And for example, now we talk about materials, use materials in ways that most people in the beginning thought that's crazy. But then it turned out it's not so crazy. You can actually have asphalt in the kitchen. It works quite well. So I think that is a tremendous accomplishment, another one, of Frank Gehry and what he did for the professional architecture. Being here to commemorate, Frank Gehry.
I have a question. You kind of touched on the idea of creating like the next Frank Gehry, and I think back to the notion of kind of the author architect, and Gehry is deserves that title because his work's very iconic. So I guess my question is a little bit: does it really matter, like in the society that we live in today? Does it matter creating the next Gehry or Eisen or Khalid? Because of all of the different implications that we have. And I know, Marcus, you write a little bit about this.
I mean, you know my answer. You are one of the few in here who actually reads my books. But no, absolutely it matters. It's a cliche that you can get a bunch of more or less mediocre people together if they work in a team that they want to accomplish greatness. It's always going to be individual human beings who are able to make some sort of step that gets you further, that gets us further as humanity, as mankind. That will never change. That will never change. No matter what you hear. So I'm absolutely, maybe my colleagues have other opinions, but if you ask me directly to share this, absolutely the world needs authors, and I use the word author, it's not just people who write, but somebody who has an idea and create something in whatever discipline you do it. You can be a cook, you can be a carpenter, you can be a lawyer, you can be an architect. I think, or I'm absolutely convinced that there's good evidence when you look at this. This has not changed. Even today, the situation is not different than from 300 years ago. There are individuals who embody, they do consequential work that moves the world forward. Yeah.
But on the other hand, you cannot separate from the influences of interactions with other people. Because Frank Gehry doesn't work alone in his office. He's working with others, and other people come in and out. Like the person who put the bottle inspired him. So there's a leader, of course, but his reach would be, I think, lesser if he was not impacted by everybody else that he's interacting with and that he's being inspired by and that he's discussing and arguing with. So it's really difficult to separate. I think that it's a simplification to be able to publish, let's say, or to make public or famous. So that there's a simplification for one individual, but the reality is that it couldn't happen without everybody else around contributing negatively or positively or in any way, somehow helping that.
Argument. Buildings are not built by one person. We know that. So I don't think we need to discuss that. We know there are a lot of people involved in taking takings like buildings. Even a small building is still a relatively large undertaking. Again, I gave a lecture this fall, and I mentioned that in that little house that I live in, on the construction side, there were about, I think, 50 or 60 people in there, and each there had certain specific skills. But that's not the same what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the person who ultimately ultimately, somebody has to ultimately make a judgment. We go this way and this way. I mean, my entire talk here was, of course, the argument that Gehry was exceptionally good at understanding his world he lived in, his environment. He had the right people he surrounded himself. So then we talk about the artist that he was a young man. He was not hanging out with his people. He knew, okay, there are a bunch of good artists. I better hang out here because I learned something. Later on, when he had his office, obviously he had to hire people. Of course, it wasn't. He had to make, somebody had to decide. Early on, certainly Gehry himself decided who works in his office. Later on, of course, when his office had 200 people, I'm sure Gehry was not making any single decision who works there. But still, I mean, it is the judgment of an individual human being, whether you do it this way or that way, will never go away. And then you cannot elevate this. This is not, you cannot do this by keyboard. That doesn't work.
I think that individual can choose specifically who they, by choosing who they surround themselves with and who they work with in the studio, then influences their individual decisions. So I feel like how, you can individually choose to surround yourself with, but ultimately everyone around you who, the water bottle, that was someone else's doing that influenced what your individual choice on that building was. So I think surrounding yourself, especially going to different, we talk about going to aerospace and going to different, I'm really interested in construction, the CATA software, software is very I think it was very important in I think that I really liked how he was able to integrate multiple different people and different professions into one and make it possible, make his imagination possible for others.
You know, just stay on his water bottle for a second. The bottle became famous now. The fact that Gehry surrounded himself with employees who dared to leave the water bottle there before they left home, that sort of informality. Where in the office that I was working as an architect, I would never dare to leave a water bottle, on the model. I mean, I think I would be fired the next day. So, see, this is the sort of the aura that you're creating, the sort of the intellectual environment, and what is possible and what is not. Of course, you surround yourself with people, but that is not just accidental. That is something that is created, and that is part of an architect. It is a part of the responsibility of an architect if you have an office that you hire the right people. Otherwise, it's not going to go well. And that's a part of the competence. You have to know people, you have to know the world, and who fits into the team. And that's creative, that's an act of creativity and judgment.
What I was going to add was almost exactly what you said. It's the spirit of openness. Steve Jobs, probably wrongfully took credit for too many things, but the thing that he stated publicly was that his job was to, number one, assemble an extremely talented team, and then number two, provide them with an environment that allowed them the maximum amount of creative potential. And he had role models before him like Hewlett Packard, who would bring out donuts at 10 o'clock with coffee. And there's just a congenial environment where people from the lowest level of interns to the highest level of project managers could contribute ideas. I have one anecdote, which was a very young designer was working with a small team at Gehry's office on the Lewis residence and was asked to do a number of things. And if I remember correctly, she had this idea late at night when she was at home to take felt and melted wax and make an amorphous folded shape with the felt, but then stiffen the felt and hold its sculptural form by pouring hot wax over it. And she came back to the studio the next morning, and supposedly Frank Gehry put his hand on his heart and said, "This is exactly what I've been searching for my entire life." And then his architectural language kind of turned on a dime as a result of this very young designer coming up with this harebrained idea to take felt and hot wax and propose that as a legitimate means of designing an architectural model. So, you know, I would say it requires Gehry's boldness to say, I'm confident enough, I can show this to a client, this melted ball of wax. It requires a certain level of confidence and boldness to make that decision, but it also requires an environment that's open and accepting enough for, you know, wacky ideas to come to the fore.
Maybe I have a question. You talk about newness, and then you talk about iconic, and I wonder if we maybe talk a little bit about the difference between pushing the boundary and being novel or newness, and being iconic or fashionable. Because I think a lot of people might doubt about the position of the architect in the sense of pushing a boundary versus being iconic. And the two are not really the same. I want to ask you, what is that line that defines the two, if there is any? And I mean, it's open to everyone.
Between newness and what?
And being iconic or fashion.
Iconic.
And maybe also add the role of boldness in this.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I tried to make that point. I mean, fashionable is I would characterize as more as sort of an expression of a sort of a lifestyle or a sort of movement, something that is touches on the towards entertainment. And there is also a newness to that. You know, we have to be careful. But the newness that I try to, the way I try to articulate is it's an extremely serious search, a sort of ontological importance. I mean, that really matters of our place, relationship between human beings and our relationship with the world. That's a sort of really, that's the sort of newness. The other one, fashionable, you know, I don't have a definition ready, you know, how I would define fashionable. But again, it's not a sort of a lifestyle sort of, you know. For example, architecture has become very popular in the last 20 years by corporate, you know, by corporate America, corporate world. They realize that if you have a good building or a decent building, that it helps with your branding and identity. That is a completely different motivation in terms of newness than what Frank Gehry is doing. There it is again, it's a part of a marketing scheme, a sort of branding, and that sort of, you know, and architecture has to some degree has profited from it because it allowed certain people to get commissions because of that decision that was made by other people who really didn't see architecture so much as really what we might be interested or what I suggest newness is for, but more as a marketing strategy. And that's a sort of more, I would say that's a sort of in the realm of lifestyle, wellness, sort of, you know, sort of the upper middle class who constantly goes to museums and good restaurants and does yoga and all these kind of little things in order to sort of lifestyle thing. That is not, that's not what we're talking about when we talk about newness. At least not the way I would talk about it, and not really how it is discussed in sort of the architectural theoretical discourse. That's entertainment. That's it. That exists too, and it exists probably to a much larger degree because, you know, we can, for example, I mentioned Gaudi. Now you go to Barcelona, you have to get your ticket pretty early on, otherwise you want to stand in line a very long time to see Gaudi's architecture. And that has become a sort of an expression of lifestyle. That's why people go to see Antoni Gaudi. So Gaudi, now Santa is also a very popular architect. But when he built his buildings, it didn't click. Look, I think Gaudi is a very, very good architect. And we can have a longer discussion about this and what's good and so on. But in terms of the sort of the newness in relationship as a social house of architecture, that buildings initiate a sort of a discourse that people can engage with, not to convince them of something. This is not what we do today. I mean, maybe 500 years ago, architects tried to convince, or the people who architects worked for tried to convince people of certain values. I think today that would not be something that would be doable. Yeah, so I stop. Yeah.
Do you think that creating a newness in architecture, like as an architect, is something that should be sought out? And especially with Frank Gehry, do you think he was seeking out creating something new or creating something that's never been done before? Or do you think he was doing what felt right to him and what was like in his artistic expression? Or do you think he was seeking a breakthrough?
Every serious architect must seek out newness. Otherwise, there are no architects. Builders can do that. The rest can. I don't know what we do it, but I said it in a very extreme way. If an architect is not seeking newness, you can stop it.
So can I add something like this? Since most of the room is 18-year-olds, I think in order to seek out something that's new, there is a wealth of knowledge that you must collect in order to even start seeking that out. There's 4 people right here that are amazing resources. All of your colleagues are amazing resources. One story below you, amazing resource. I mean, I think if you just decide today you're going to go back to your desk and you're going to make something new, and you're going to ignore all of these outside sources, you are going to fail miserably.
And it is extremely difficult to do something, to make something new that is acceptable to the world. Extremely difficult. Only a few people can actually accomplish it. So there is no, what should we try? Should you, as a young architect, I cannot imagine to be an architect. I'm not seeking that newness, that sort of statement that brings us forward as a people. If that is not your motivation, I don't know what to do.
I think ultimately we all just have to do what we want to do. And both my parents are residential architects, and neither of them ever sought to upend anything. They just simply delighted in the pleasure of drawing a house well and a craftsman house. And plenty of people want to make or start a pizza restaurant, and with no desire to upend the notion of what pizza is. They just simply want to make pizza, and they produce an exquisite piece of pizza, and it, contributes to the beauty of this world. So I wouldn't say that it truly, I don't think it's an imperative, and it would obviously be a disaster if every single architect was seeking some extremely idiosyncratic language. I think we all just have to, follow our own, personal impulses and intuitions. And Gehry had a particular thing that he wanted to say with his architecture, just like Kafka had a particular thing he wanted to say with his books, or Philip Glass wanted to say with his music that no other person could say. And whether that desire, you were born with it, or whether you discover it, or it emerges slowly, I think it's slightly out of your hands. I would say one other thing about newness, though, is and its power and kind of how it works. Andy Warhol has a famous line, he has many, but he would say about a great artist, that person got it exactly wrong. Not that person got it exactly right. Because to get something exactly right means that you're exactly wrong means you understand exactly what the mainstream taste desires, and you inverse absolutely everything. And I think arguably Frank Gehry did that literally in the realm of fashion. I'll never forget, I was living in New York City in 2014. It's not really a thing anymore, but I'll never forget, I was having dinner with a friend, and there was a male model at the dinner, and he was wearing dad shoes. And you guys did the dad shoes phenomena. I was horrified. I couldn't, this was just completely unacceptable to be wearing. It was just the antithesis of what was cool, and it's not some sexy leather shoe. It was a hideous, white sneaker with these plain, it just looked, it was the ugliest thing I'd ever seen in my life. And then several days later, I was like, oh my God, that's exactly why it was so brilliant. And then about 6 months later, the dad shoe phenomenon exploded. And then suddenly, major fashion houses such as Balenciaga and Prada and so on took the dad shoe and saw in it this potential for formalistic expression. You have all sorts of wonderful new inventions within this kind of typology of this hideous dad shoe kind of thing. And so I think that ultimately, where does creativity and newness come from? It's hard to put a finger on it, but if you're doing something that it's possible that if what you're doing is in exact disagreement with the commonly accepted taste at the time, you might be on the right track.
Yeah, but I think also it's important to separate, because there were many terms used here, and I think it's important to distinguish newness is a much deeper value related to a contribution to the discipline, to innovating in some form, and it's not so much taste or fashion, which is more superficial and trendy and seasonal, but that it's something that has a much deeper meaning, that you're standing on the shoulders of somebody else to take architecture further and further and further. So it's about architecture, it's not about the person, the icon, the fashion, the trend. And it can be huge and it can be small. It is a contribution, right? And so through your work, you're bringing something new to the discourse of architecture. It's not a look, right?
I want to say that, I really liked your kind of like, is it this path or is it this path sort of formulation, just as a kind of place to start. And I think we're in kind of dangerous territory where we're describing how this person became great, basically, right? And I think that from your point of view, maybe you think, oh, okay, well, let me take some notes here. Because I think everybody here wants to make great work, or at least very good work. I don't think anybody wants to put out a bad project, but that's not your goal. But I think you can get derailed by the means that somebody achieved that particular newness or that particular contribution to architecture. There's a kind of, there's a really nice, it's a very old phrase that says, don't follow the master, but seek what they saw. And if you get caught up in the means that somebody went by doing something, you're not doing your work, actually. And that's not so much fun, and it doesn't go so far either. It's not really a discovery. You have all of this at your disposal right now, right? Why are we spending so much time designing new buildings? Why are we designing new chairs? This building keeps the rain out. It's pretty good. It's got great light. I love this building. Is the project over? This chair is pretty good, except for it's pretty slippery. Or is the project over? No, of course not. None of these projects are over. And I think that it's important to ask yourself, why are we spending so much time working in the realm of something that, from the point of view of a problem to solve, it's already done. It's something else. It's much more nuanced and more complex than that. I think you can take both of your paths simultaneously, right? Just simply pulling the thread. And I think you can cultivate. You can cultivate curiosity. You can exercise imagination. Imagination is a sensibility. You can work on it. You can spend time. I think the kind of key in Gary's work in a lot of ways is the amount of time spent just looking, not rushing past. When we work on these models, that you're rolled into a big room, the doors closed, very hard right now, especially if you're in this kind of a mode. It's hard to stay with something. I think architecture is going to demand that. Develop and cultivate your curiosity, exercise your imagination, try things out, make lots of mistakes, and as Ben said, just follow your passion. Do what you're excited about. You can't do anybody else's work. But if you don't find that, it's going to be tough. It's a tough discipline without that drive that is yours. And you can practice this now. You're not trying to make a great project for your professor. Right? I mean, we are here as guides. We are here to help you find your way, but you're not trying to please us. That's a completely different model of education and thinking than what you have spent the previous 12 or whatever, 15 years doing. Find your own work. This is to the question of judgment. You develop it by spending time with it. There was a faculty member who's retired some years now. He used to tell a story about the architect Adolf who was walking down the street with his wife, and he would always stop in front of a pawn shop, and he would just look at the window of the pawn shop. He would spend a considerable amount of time. And he was like, "Come on, we got what? Like, why are we always stopping here?" And he said, "I'm trying to find the best thing." What is that? What is the best thing? What is the best of these projects? And if you can hold a question like that lightly